Are airlines right now changing the way that they're making money from you? And are we in fact on the way back towards the golden days of aviation back in the 60s and 70s? And if that's the case, at what price? Stay tuned. Back in the end of 2020, when people heard of that first vaccines and that they would be rolled out in a matter of weeks, many airlines around the world saw an explosion of travel reservations. For some destinations, the rise in demand went up with a staggering 700% in just a few hours. And as one CEO of a European airline put it, it's like people are literally sitting on packed suitcases, waiting for the chance to go somewhere, anywhere. Well, as we now know, a lot of people had to actually wait a bit longer than those few weeks because of the ever-changing travel restrictions and rules that came with it. And on top of those changing rules, the airlines and airports also experienced some real ramp-up issues, which just added to the customers' frustrations. But then finally, by the end of 2022, and certainly now by 2023, the travel boom is now in full swing, and most airlines are really loving it. But interestingly, not all airlines are completely happy, even if their planes are relatively full. And that's because this eager, travel-thirsty public going on vacation aren't necessarily the type of passengers that many airlines have historically been relying on. This is true for both short and medium haul, but especially for long-haul airlines, which is what I'll be focusing on today. So, why is that then? Who do these airlines really want traveling on their planes? Well, to understand that, it's worth going back to the golden age of aviation as it once was. In several of my recent videos, I have looked at a number of classic airliners and how they helped change the face of aviation. Those include the Comet, the DC-3, the Connie, the 707, and I've also looked at some of the other jets that were less successful, like the Convair 990, for example. Now, obviously, the focus of those videos was on the aircraft, but one of the more persistent types of comments we received on those videos had to do with the period footage that we used showing the passenger cabins in those old aircraft. And that was because they typically showed comfortable, roomy cabins with food served on nice plates, sometimes even set on proper tablecloths. Obviously, it's hard to look at that and not make some comparisons about the way that flying looks today, and quite a lot of you pointed out that flying is just not what it used to be. So what happened? How did we lose this luxury, and why don't we see that level of service in economy cabins today? Well, it turns out that the reality is that the airlines back then could do that because they actually could afford to do so, and there were actually two different reasons for that. Firstly, fuel costs back then were a mere fraction of what they are today, so even though those old jets were real gas guzzlers, it wasn't that hard for the airlines to still make them reasonably profitable and to fill them with passengers. And secondly, the airlines could afford to provide all of this stuff to their passengers because back then flying was expensive. And I mean really expensive. In 1960, if you wanted to fly from New York to London using Pan American Airways, you could expect to pay around $550 for a return ticket. Now, that might not sound too bad until you realize that that's $550 1960s dollars, which would be over $4,000 in today's value. And that's for a return ticket in economy. So why was that then? And why did I use exactly $550 as an example? Well, the answer is simply that that's the price the airlines had to sell the New York to London ticket for. They didn't have a choice in that matter. For an airline like Pan Am, ticket prices were actually set by a US government agency called the Civil Aeronautics Board. Having healthy airlines was seen as a vitally important priority back then, so the US and other countries made sure that the airlines could make good money without worrying too much about competition. This situation started to come to an end in 1978 with the Airline Deregulation Act. It primarily involved domestic US travel, but soon after it was ratified, the industry also saw the first open skies and other freedoms of the air agreements, which still regulate many of the rules around international air travel today. Now, obviously, this is a huge topic, and there are more factors at play here, like the introduction of much higher capacity wide-body jets, which really improved the economics for the airlines, and of course also the rise in fuel prices in the 1970s, which really didn't improve anything except maybe driving innovation. But once the dust had settled, all of these changes gave us the airline industry that we broadly see still today, like large carriers standardized on a hub and spoke network, and the newer carriers which evolved the point-to-point working model. This new reality meant that everyone, particularly the legacy carriers, had to get a little bit creative with their airfares in order to stay profitable.
Is it me or is this plane really filthy?
That's typical. This used to be a great airliner before deregulation.
You see, even after the airlines were free to set their own prices, it became clear that a good number of passengers out there were prepared to pay a little bit more than the rest. And I'm not referring to the first class passengers, those already existed before the 1970s. No, instead, these were passengers who wanted a middle segment, so the idea of splitting the cabin further to create what's now known as business class between first and economy came about back then, between 1977 to 1979. Some airlines actually still to this day squabble about who came up with the idea first, since they all had different names for it. Now, as it turns out, even earlier in the 70s, some airlines had already started to split the economy cabin between what they referred to as full fare and discounted fare sections. Then, gradually, full fare economy morphed into business class, which often included some first class perks like free access to airport lounges, for example. And economy then became what we know it to be today, a pared down or discounted version of travel with significantly fewer perks. In other words, those lavish economy cabins of the early 1960s that we looked at before, which cost $4,000 in today's currency for a transatlantic flight, were in reality equivalent to today's business class. So actually, if you look at it that way, then business class today is probably even cheaper on average and much more comfortable too. Now, all of these changes obviously open up travel to many more people, and it also opened up for completely new types of airlines. So, where are we today and how are things changing? Well, I'll explain all you need to know after this. Have you ever wondered if maintaining your online privacy is as comfortable as a first-class seat? Spoiler alert, it is not. Unfortunately, we now live in a world where there's an entire industry of companies known as data brokers who collect all available information about you and then sell it to the highest bidders, which tends to be scammers, identity thieves, and even worse, scum. But luckily, there is now a solution to this problem, which is today's sponsor, Incogni. Incogni is a service that fights data brokers on your behalf by making sure your name and data is removed from all of their lists. I have been using them for about 6 months now, and it has been fascinating to see how they've been chasing these companies down. It turns out that my data was actually being sold by 51 different data brokers. No wonder my inbox was so full of spam. If you want to stop your data from being sold, then use the link here below, which is incogni.com/mentornow, and use the code MENTORNOW. This will give you an incredible Black Friday deal of 60% off the annual price, but the link will still work even after this week, but with a different deal. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's continue. One of the biggest changes in the aviation industry during the last few decades is, of course, the advent of low-cost carriers. Southwest Airlines actually popularized this trend of lowering fares even before the airline deregulation. So initially, they had to keep all of their flights within Texas to get around those old federal rules of interstate fare prices. Other airlines did the same, flying within California even before Southwest, and today low-cost carriers are a global phenomenon, which is still expanding in many markets out there, whether you like it or not. Their ultra-efficient operating models have even forced some more traditional carriers to basically start using the low-cost model for domestic and short to medium-haul travel. But what about low-cost long-haul travel? Well, a lot of airlines have tried to start up this type of model, but only a handful have actually had any real success with it. So why is that? Well, to understand that, we have to go through some basics about how low-cost carriers work in the first place. Analyzing this properly would make this video unbearably long, but in short, the vast majority of low-cost carriers specialize in a few things, including maximizing the time they keep their aircraft in the air, and they do that by using really quick turnarounds. Low-cost carriers also sometimes rely on secondary airports to keep the handling and landing fees down, and the use of these airports can actually help differentiate them from other airlines if they pick their routes carefully. This is what carriers like Breeze and Avelo in the United States are right now doing, as I explained in my last video. But another characteristic of low-cost carriers is the way that they structure their ticket prices. Most of them will pare down their fares, removing almost all ancillary benefits like choosing a seat, having checked baggage, or even carry-on luggage in many cases. Now the same goes for Wi-Fi if it's even available, and of course onboard meals. Obviously, all of this is now the general rules of the game. Each airline will treat these rules a little bit differently, but that is now how the low-fare game is being played. Crucially though, low-cost carriers still expect many passengers to pay extra for a lot of these ancillary options, which often form a significant part of their revenue and overall strategy. So, could this low-cost carrier tactics work well even for long-haul flights? Well, let's start by looking at the quick turnarounds. Now, long-haul usually involves larger aircraft, which will involve more work between flights, including baggage handling and of course fueling and cleaning. But the main issue here usually evolves around the routes themselves. You see, figuring out a route network that keeps an airliner in the air as much as possible with short and medium haul flights that go through just 2 or 3 time zones is already quite challenging. But in a part of the world like Europe or the United States, airliners generally have a lot of different route options so they can choose from, and that makes it possible. But that becomes significantly harder for long-haul flights that have to operate between a much bigger range of different time zones. Remember, the aircraft needs to arrive and depart at reasonable hours when airports are open and people are actually willing to fly. And on top of that, pilots and cabin crew will have shorter available duty times when they have to fly through what they perceive as night, making scheduling even more complicated and requiring more crew. But we also need to consider what happens if things start to go wrong. For example, if there is some kind of technical issue with an aircraft. Now, if you're a low-cost carrier in Europe or the US and an aircraft has some technical problem, holding it at an airport until a spare part arrives will of course suck. But getting that part out or having a new aircraft sent out from another base to replace it is normally possible to organize in just a matter of hours, especially if you have a big fleet. But that's very different if your aircraft is stuck on a different continent. Then it's obviously a much more time-consuming and costly affair. And also bear in mind that long-haul carriers generally have much fewer aircraft available to use than short or medium-haul airlines do. Well, unless you're Emirates or Qatar or maybe some other airline that I can't remember right now. Remind me in the comments below. And whilst you're down there, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The point here though is that for most long-haul airlines, finding a spare 787 or Airbus A330 or another widebody for that matter is pretty hard to do. So what this all means is that after an airline like that have paid the enormous costs of having to potentially lease another aircraft, paying hotel rooms for all of the stranded passengers and crew, one single of those events could make the whole operation very hard to even break even. This is something that Norwegian long-haul had to learn the hard way in the beginning of their operation, where they had big problems with their Boeing 787s. Anyway, then there comes the question of the lower ticket prices and ancillary revenue for long-haul, and here you might think that the low-cost carriers might have an edge, since the removal of these ancillaries gives passengers more options to pick just the stuff that they want to have. But while that might be the case for short and medium haul, for long haul, low-cost carriers have a very different problem, which in some cases means that the more traditional carriers can often actually beat their prices. And that brings us back to the creation of business class. Remember how I said that business class used to be called full fare and what we now call economy class was discounted fare? Well, it turns out that there's actually some honesty in the term full fare, which has to do with how profitable a trip can be if the full fare or business class seats are actually full. You see, basically, traditional airlines make enough money from that front section of the cabin to allow a lot of empty economy seats while still operating a profitable flight. This, by the way, is why some airlines maintain a really premium heavy layout in their big jets. Building a reputation as a premium airline can be really valuable. If that means that you can keep some big jets filled with business class passengers, but maybe suffer a little bit on the economy passenger side. This is actually very central in how the Gulf Airlines can work the way they do, and it also explains why the Airbus A380 works as well as it does for Emirates. Before retiring their 747s in 2020, British Airways also used a very premium heavy seat layout in those jets, and they still do in their A380s. All this flexibility when business seats are full comes in very handy if a traditional airline is trying to beat the price of a startup low-cost long-haul carrier. With fully booked business seats, traditional carriers can simply sell their economy seats much cheaper, completely underselling a low-cost competitor. And on top of that, they seldom risk losing their business class passengers because they have their premium brand and infrastructure of lounges and award programs. So, does this mean that all low-cost long-haul operators are doomed to fail? Well, it is true that some early efforts in this sector didn't go very well. These include WOW Air in Iceland, a low-cost carrier that flew long-haul with Airbus A330s, and Norwegian Air Shuttle, which, as I mentioned, use 787s in the same role. The problem for both of these airlines was that they introduced long-haul flights and wide-body jets on top of their more conventional low-cost short and medium-haul operations. WOW went out of business in 2019 and Norwegian Air restructured, downsized and then stuck to operations with its 737s instead. Now, there was obviously a lot more to the stories of what went wrong with these airlines, which I don't have time to go through here, but other dedicated low-cost long-haul operations have actually done a lot better because they still had a couple of tricks up their sleeve. One of those tricks was to find a niche, a set of routes that no or very few other airlines cover directly. That's the strategy of French Bee, which has a fleet of Airbus A350s who they fly predominantly between Paris-Orly Airport and destinations like French Polynesia and Réunion. Since these places are officially part of France, it also means that legally these are domestic flights, which was a little fact that became very, very handy in 2020 and in 2021 when international flights were seriously limited. Now, French Bee also fly to some US destinations, and actually they fly to French Polynesia only after stopping in the United States, whilst several US carriers also fly to Polynesia. But the airline still maintains its niche because even with a stop, passengers fly faster between French Polynesia and mainland France with them than they would if they flew there, to the United States first using Hawaiian or Delta Airlines, for example, and then they would need to catch a connection to Paris. Of course, that niche that French Bee has found is really specific to France and wouldn't necessarily scale well somewhere else. But there are things that other low-cost long-haul operators can do to compete with more traditional airlines, and one of them has to do with another trend in aircraft passenger seats. Because, as they say, if you can't beat them, join them. I said previously that the traditional seating model with economy, business and first class is changing. And the way it is doing so is with the addition of something called premium economy. As its name suggests, premium economy is basically a bit better than normal economy. For some airlines, the actual seat is either the same as the standard economy seat or a very close fit to it, whilst other airlines have better seats with a bit of a recline as well. In both cases, you can expect more legroom, which could really make a difference if you're a taller than average person and you want to fly long haul, and you can also expect some better service. Depending on the airline, this might mean nicer food or food at a time of your choosing, early boarding, more luggage allowance and other perks. For a lot of airlines, booking a seat in business class normally costs around 3 to 4 times what an economy seat would go for. So the idea here is that premium economy will split the difference between the two. Now, some airline bosses like Qatar's Akbar Al Bakr, who recently stepped down, aren't particularly fond of the idea of premium economy, but he is definitely in a minority right now. United Airlines say that Premium Plus, as they call it, is their most profitable long-haul product, and I can definitely understand why. Other airlines are adding or increasing premium economy seats to their fleets as well, chasing rising passenger demand, and like I said, for many airlines, the seats are basically the same, so readjusting their operations to this new model is relatively easy. And that brings us back to low-cost long-haul operators. You see, if replacing a few seats is all it takes to turn a section of the passenger cabin into premium economy, well, then why not try it? And as it turns out, this is exactly what they're doing. Norse Atlantic is flying a number of Boeing 787-9s with 282 regular economy and 56 premium economy seats, which are both wider and recline a bit more. And French-Bee is also doing something very similar right now with their Airbus A350s. But there is one final twist to this story. As I've already said, premium economy basically fills the gap between business and economy, but it does so by using an improved economy seat. Now, what if someone did it the other way around, by using a seat that is more like a simplified business class seat? Well, that's kind of what JetBlue is doing with its transatlantic Mint cabin. This is a lie-flat seat that is still business class, but in the same single-aisle A321neos that JetBlue already operates on its network. The idea is that JetBlue will offer this for less than what a business class usually would cost by putting a lot more of these seats in its planes. Normally, an A321neo has an exit limit of 240 passenger seats, and some low-cost carriers do actually operate it in that configuration. But JetBlue's transatlantic A321 long ranges, which are basically A321neos with extra fuel tanks, only have seats for 138 passengers, including 24 of these Mint seats. Now, I'm not sure exactly how much these seats sell for in practice though. The travel demand of the past few months makes things very, very hard to compare. So let me know if any of you have been flying on them recently. Tell me in the comments what kind of prices they have been. Another great example of this, by the way, is the low-fare company flydubai, which has some truly awesome flatbed business class seats installed on their Boeing 737 MAXes. But obviously, again, for a much more affordable price than the Gulf flag carriers are offering. And flydubai have, by the way, just announced that they're getting Boeing 787, so it looks like they are also getting themselves into the low-fare long-haul game. In any case, as you can see, the industry is still trying out new ideas, while it's also reinventing some old ones. For low-cost carriers that wants to try out long-haul, ultimately the biggest problem might well be their smaller fleet sizes, because whatever strategy that they choose to use, larger airlines will always have more options on how and where to use their planes and people as they try out these new things. And the really great news is that there is now really strong demand for air travel, which means that everyone is busy, and that means both new and old airlines to try to find out new, different, cool things to get the attention of you. So if you want to try something closer to the feel of a 1960s passenger experience, these new innovations means that you might be able to do so, and possibly for a substantially lower price than you would have had to pay back then. So with all of this in mind, in my view, even though a lot of people are complaining about how aviation is not what it used to be, the reality is that aviation is so much more right now, and the availability of choice means that a lot more people can choose to fly, in whatever comfort they choose or can afford. Now, you can support the work that we do here by sending us a super thanks, buying a t-shirt, or using the link here below to join my fabulous Patreon crew. If you do that, then you will have a chance to impact the way that we create this type of content, and you will also be able to join my great Zoom Hangouts. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.